If you are familiar with Desiderata, you will probably agree that it is a gem in literary art. There are also other authors and thinkers who discovered wonderful guidelines in it towards better parenthood and more. I could never share anything like this with those who considered themselves above average and extremely wise. This was undoubtedly one way of hiding their lack. Some of my associates belonged to that category, including my ex-partner and children. I ached to tell them what I discovered, but since it was not contained in their Bible, as far as they were concerned, my findings could not be true. One of the wisdoms I read was, "Children learn what they live." Admittedly, I was captivated by it, often using it as a guideline like a few other authors I became familiar with over the years. I am sure many parents are conversant with the concept that every child is unique in their own way. What parent could deny that seeing their youngsters growing up is priceless? We therefore need to make time for what is cherished, realizing that our children are most precious. It is really fascinating to see how they learn everything from us. Yet some parents tend to teach their young only how to downgrade and judge people, as I have personally experienced. Regrettably, during my marriage of several years, I learned that many witnesses teach their children to see only wrong with the outside world, rather than what is right. You may or may not agree that parents often habitually criticize their children using the tone of their voice, eye contact, and sometimes verbally. Admittedly, when I read this notion for the first time in a library book, Children Learn What They Live by Dorothy Low Nolt and Rachel Harris, expanding on the universally loved poem, I was surprised how close it was to my way of thinking. However, if the child is momentarily unable to obey our commands or does not respond to us as quickly as expected, what would be the best thing to do? I believe it is far better to show a little more tolerance and patience, knowing we were doing the same things. When observing Magda's attitude towards the children, it was clear to see what parental background she came from, and the characteristics she displayed with her persistent emphasis on finding fault in them proved to be unsound and, in fact, dangerous for their future. I believe that was due to her upbringing, always trying to find fault in everybody. Her frequent criticisms under the careful supervision of religious intolerance could only develop oft judgmental and negative trends in the children. Reassuring them and creating a positive atmosphere would be far better when facing parenthood concerns. Then again, this may not be applicable to Jehovah's Witness families, for they are, as they claim, as perfect as their Father God is. When minor accidents happen and things get broken, we should remember that we have done just the same when we were young. Sometimes parents respond to their children without thinking, but when we become aware of it, a little apology can go a long way. However, when I did so, Magda never agreed with me, instead advising me not to be too childish. I always believed that it was much better to put all the attention to what happened and not the child. For example, when a child falls and hurts their knee, it is better to look at what happened rather than punishing the child. Unfortunately, when Claude spilt milk on the table, all hell broke loose. Magda believed that she had the God-given wisdom and foresight to handle circumstances more effectively by consulting her brothers in faith. But remember, we can all still learn more. Maybe one needs to think outside the square. Furthermore, patience with our children is very important, even when we have minor disagreements. As parents, we need to listen to our children without demanding, respecting their ideas no matter how naive, and in turn, they become more willing to share their thoughts with us. One should never, ever interrogate them to talk to us. In fact, I honestly believe this is how their mother unknowingly taught them to tell lies to gain her favor. Nonetheless, what Magda was doing, under the influence of her associates, has not been anything other than interrogation. She believed that the God-given wisdom through her associates was enough, no matter how mediocre their knowledge was. Remember, their elders were not trained or experienced in child psychology, but they were the only decision-makers who did not even understand how a mother would feel. There certainly was a detrimental way towards so-called progression. Children must be encouraged to do the right thing, but how can one do it effectively? What rules do we need to follow? What would be the best approach, since the ways of the witnesses, as one discovers through Magda's standpoint, was not right? We can at least tell the children that they are also right. I wished that Magda would agree with me for once, that emphasis on punishment instead of reasonable discipline was not creating any unity, and the children were only living in fear. She believed in instilling in them the fear of God for their salvation in the new world order. Yet we are constantly preached that God is a God of love. However, on all fronts they prove that their God is not. After our much-anticipated separation, every time Claude came to my place, his mother interrogated him about her instructions he had to follow down to the minutest detail, including eating certain foods or associating with other children. Whenever he exclaimed that he forgot, she punished him regardless. She was very keen about their health, encouraging them never to consume colored and preservative-laden sweets. Yet later discoveries show that she was literally living on those types of sweets. Obviously, the witnesses forgot to instruct her about the principles of teaching one's children by example. Her constant nagging was not helpful. It is a very unproductive way to teach, and certainly not a beneficial way to make improvements in the children. The only thing she could do was teach them all about the end of the world and the good news they had to preach to others. When Magda, not believing Claude, demanded to hear the supposed truth while holding both his shoulders and fiercely shaking him to admit to his lies, and then physically punishing the boy, it did not help the child. Her treatment of Claude, consequently, led the way for him to tell lies in order to gain her approval. On one side, she hoped that her husband was going to do such harsh disciplining, and on the other, she never accepted any of his suggestions. Therefore, we had a huge dilemma. One needs to understand that what I'm considering here is not to be critical of Magda, but it is like holding a mirror in front of the cult members, reflecting the results of witness indoctrinations which are not based on scriptural wisdom. In reality, our children learn everything from what they see on a daily basis, and in the process they become extremely good in detecting all our faults as well as our positive attributes. Imagine a parent advising the child about the damage smoking causes, while at the same time smoking. Endless nagging distresses a child unnecessarily, and is usually taken as being belittled. If people would only stop complaining, they might understand how detrimental it is when they nag about their spouses in front of their children. This too was my experience when living with Magda, for she has done more harm by complaining about me to the children. Therefore, I have to emphasize that it is certainly better to talk about each other's shortcomings in private. Talking about one's partner negatively to one's offspring can only be to deliberately prepare them to hate the other. Remember that children continually learn from their parents, and parents can also learn from them. But Jehovah's Witness parents would never accept this notion. Whenever I attempted to explain something like this, Magda was ever ready to laugh, never taking it seriously. Was I not a total ignoramus? She constantly emphasized that we are living in a very wicked and hostile world. Indeed, when we observe the media, we quickly discover how our newspapers and television programs are replete with reports of the ugliest kind. As far as I was concerned, forever being nagged in front of the children was having a very adverse effect on them, and I dared say nothing to her. When we are antagonistic to one another all the time, because one of us is assumed to have done wrong by not believing in what we think is right, this would train our children to feel extremely vulnerable in the world. Consider how Magda was asking her brothers for their permission and approval for everything she did. And I'm certain that she has not changed, even today. Remember, women are forever commanded to be subservient by the witnesses. Nevertheless, any kind of anger, hatred, and bitterness can only teach children that they always have to fight to overcome conflicts and get what they want. Imagine what kind of people they become. I believe it is worthwhile to consider the circumstances surrounding us in a more resourceful way. Ideally, if we choose stress-free, easygoing lifestyles, often smiling, we soon discover what beautiful smiles we are responded with. The world is like a mirror, reflecting our own image back to us. Firstly, we need to eliminate those worries which are bound to be experienced in our daily lives. Can it be done? There are several ways one can consider. For instance, by developing hobbies, such as reading, telling stories, painting works of art, creative meditations, and sport, we can teach our children so much more. However, these activities need not be the way witnesses see fit, and my ex-wife's adopted philosophies. This is where fantasy and science fiction can be useful, but she is led to believe that all science fiction is lies, instigated by the devil. As one can see, we had nothing in common. On the other hand, we must not forget that children have the same rights as us. And if you notice, we tend to talk about our inner feelings as well as frustrations. This is also why children should be able to express their inner feelings freely, without quashing them, even when certain religious traditions may interfere. Remember, some fanatical religious viewpoints may be in complete opposition to this idea. My children's lifestyle is the result of such fanaticism experienced throughout their youth. Children also need to understand that parents can be frustrated with each other, but they can easily resolve their differences. In my case, Magda could only shout, telling me I should never quote from the word of her God, for I, the unbeliever, was an evil man. For a long time I lived with a daily dose of an advice to act my age, and grow up. Interestingly, whenever I opened my mouth to utter a word, I did not always speak about the Bible. But obviously she could not hear anything else other than what was printed and often erroneously interpreted in the Holy Book. I believe it is better to neutrally explain to children that we are able to find a solution to our minor concerns without blaming anybody, and they need not be concerned. However, I was never able to make any suggestions to her. What we are considering here are not just my thoughts. Other researchers and professionals are included. Honesty and trust with our children is very important in a world wherein we are likely to face difficulties. Knowing that we can turn any disappointment into an opportunity to learn from. Unfortunately, the witnesses have been extraordinarily biased in this regard, for they believe that honesty is only a Jehovah's Witness attribute. When we are able to face our errors and know what needs to be done, dealing with the problems positively, overcoming our inner conflicts, we can teach our children valuable life skills. For my ex-wife, however, this was totally unimportant, for all their conflicts could only be overcome by the viewpoints of her elders. Nonetheless, we must ensure that we do not feed our offspring to our inner demons. Neither should we feed our demons to our children. I am still very worried when the witnesses encourage children at a very young age to get baptized and make binding promises when they cannot even make proper decisions, and when older and no longer interested in their religious darkness, they are shunned and rejected. When they cannot be responsible at that young age, why should we burden them with our own theories and beliefs? This brings me to the conclusion that our day-to-day behavior creates a family structure which will most certainly be passed on to the next generation. When I read about the viewpoints of other thinkers, encouraging their readers to observe their own personal trends to see if there are any similarities with their parents' and grandparents' lifestyles, I could do naught else but fully agree with them. You will be quite astounded if you look into this aspect of life surrounding you. Some children seem to enjoy horror shows and violent video games, similar to what we did. My children continually lived in fear under Magda's guardianship, and there was always psychological abuse. No child, like my son Claude, should be left in a constant feeling of anxiety and apprehension, which would damage his way of relating to other people and the new circumstances he would face in the future. Now consider this classic question. If your child is terrified of something and needing your help, what would you do? I have known people who would tell their children not to be so stupid. In Magda's case, she would prefer to read yet another horror story from the Bible, hoping they would understand the so-called scriptural wisdom. Would it not be better to comfort the child that everything will be good again? Doing it in a fun way is the best. Magda opposed that too. Perhaps she was unable to comprehend the concept, because it was never explained by her faithful brothers, and I could never clarify anything to her, as she was completely closed towards me. In reality, she was married to her brothers in faith. I have read many books regarding parenthood by great psychologists who I respect. They emphasize the greatest fears children experience. One of them which worries them most is the separation of parents, as was evident with my own daughters, when I was no longer allowed to get close to them due to the complete rejection I experienced, and most certainly unallegedly holy advice Magda received from God's only chosen. When something as drastic as this is experienced by the young, it is usually perceived as being abandoned. It is therefore very important for the parents to first think of the best interests of their children. For Magda, helping her children to survive Armageddon and live forever as faithful witnesses was of utmost importance. For me, their health and future lives with a successful profession, wealth, and happiness were a priority. As it was said, it should be understood that parents are not leaving their children when they separate. In normal circumstances, one should never consider hiding away by not allowing them to see their father or mother any longer. But Magda had to be different, under the spell of evil advice given by her faithful brothers and sisters. I am not using this terminology lightly, for their advice could only be as evil as they are, no matter how much they may try to argue, but they cannot deny the truth, for their deeds speak volumes worldwide. The witnesses treated me as if I was the lowest criminal for allegedly questioning the spirit, and encouraged Magda to separate from me without question. They judged me based on the assumptions of others, in light of their understanding of the Bible. Alas, Magda was not able to realize that the children naturally internalized all the parental worries. I am convinced that our children were subjected to fearful comments from their mother and her faithful associates. Ideally, it would be far better to explain things without implanting unnecessary fears in them. Certainly, as responsible parents, we need to warn them to be cautious with strangers or, as the witnesses consider, the worldly people, without teaching them to assume that everybody they did not know was likely to harm them. I was not a stranger, and yet I was forcibly estranged and alienated whenever they had been preached to. They desperately needed to know that we, the parents, were there for them, no matter what. It is certainly better to raise self-confident youngsters. Remember that when someone's husband is allegedly unfaithful, it does not mean that all husbands are the same. As far as Magda was concerned, what she heard gossiped about had to be applicable for her also. Unfortunately, her unique characteristics have also become apparent in her daughters as they matured. Personally, I would feel sad if they were to continue with this trend they acquired from their beloved mother when they become adults and got married. Magda had the tendency to separate them altogether from their father because of her ungrounded fears that he was a wicked person for not believing in the archaic teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. One wonders how she could live with all the harm caused to her children. It certainly paved the way to much distasteful states in their psychological makeup as they matured, growing up unaware of past dilemmas. Indeed, the advice given by her so-called brothers and sisters under absolute evil inspiration, and certainly not originating from God, could only be from what she feared most, namely the ruler of the current world, according to their teachings. What is observed herein is not a complaint, but a truth statement. What I am observing may appear to some as complaining about my experience of the witnesses, but it is not the case. It is an attempt to present the situation in its clarity when explaining how best to deal with it positively and survive the ordeal. It certainly is not trying to downgrade anybody, nor make a character reference of anyone. You may consider my observations as real-life parables, if you like, when talking to the curious. I am not complaining about my ex-wife either, for I feel exceedingly sad about anybody trapped in dogmatic belief systems, desperately needing to wake up from their hypnotic sleep. It is time to know the real truth. It may also be an eye-opener for those who have been burdened with narrow-mindedness of all cults and fanatical belief systems. One wonders how those Jehovah's Witnesses, who initially recreated and molded Magda in their own image, doing only their bidding in all her deeds and thoughts, could live with the harm they caused. Is that what Jehovah really wanted them to do? However, I am certain that they will never consider the damage they caused to countless numbers of people all around the world, ignoring it altogether, for this is their artwork, their tableau, and tradition. In addition, they need to keep their godly nation separated from the rest of the world in order to keep it pure and clean. Magda spirited the children away from Melbourne and started to live in Perth, where she changed her and the children's names so that I could never find them and they would never see me again, even officially declaring me dead. Consider legally the situation and ponder upon where we ended up. Even when we reflect on the circumstances as within their so-called religious wisdom, remembering what the Jehovah's Witnesses preach, like subjects of love and charity, one wonders how she could reconcile with this grave sin she committed. In reality, she abducted the children, instilling in them absolute fear against their father, and made them see him as an evil monster. She replaced me with Jehovah's Witnesses in her imprisoned and controlled mind by the cultist system she was sucked into. What did she succeed in? Indeed, what have those so-called witnesses achieved? Did my children have a good education? Did they obtain a diploma in science, law, or medicine? It was my aim to help them to be well-educated people, following their own dreams and aspirations. Had she encouraged them to study towards a fulfilling profession, or continuing with their education as they tried to do with me during my youth? Although I was judged as an evildoer, I always endeavored to show confidence in my children, for I knew it was a very powerful tool to teach them self-confidence. But what she taught them was to hate the world, not be materialistic, and oppose me as if I was the rejected of God. She was determined to point a finger at me forever, encouraging the children to do the same. Could it be due to the righteousness principle they had learned from the witnesses? I am not trying to paint them as they did to me. I am only pointing at the realities we must face. My children were well educated by their supposedly all-knowing mother to do exactly the same as she had imagined in servitude to a publishing company. I still question how one could live with what happened to my family under the careful but also very sinister supervision of this cultist organization, sending their members to the houses of people to declare their righteousness of God. Repeating, I certainly never expected something like this, even when I found Annette in my bed, and Birgit giggling in the background. I wondered if both girls were acting in unison in this undesirable and unwholesome treatment of me. My children behaving in this unusual manner hurt me far more than one could take, and for a long time felt trapped into ending my life. Thankfully, nothing serious happened between Annette and me, and I have a clear conscience. I needed to concentrate on more important issues of life, one of them being my wish to forgive and ignore the situation, although it was very difficult. About this time, Annette was preparing for a school play, and all the parents were invited. During the performance, she was going to be dressed like a tiger, singing, "I Will Live Forever." I took several professional photographs of the show, but when taking her pictures, a flash of thought passed through my mind, shouting loudly that Annette was not my daughter, as she so often declared. I hoped that all my efforts and sacrifices in looking after her were not in vain, but at that moment I felt extremely saddened, heartbroken, and utterly confused. Finally, she was completely alienated against me and awfully disappointed as per her mother's wishes. I believe she wanted to create a scene and situation she could complain about, hoping to be believed. Society's tendency so biased as to believe only the complainant. Was I not painted by their mother as a social misfit for not believing in the ways of her controllers, claiming to be her genuine friends, her brothers and sisters? Apparently, all kinds of ugly things could be expected of me. Remember, they had to be right at all times. With regard to my daughter, she had been very excessive with her sexually active friends and displayed imbalanced emotions completely against the so-called morality principles of the witnesses. Her associations did not help. It has always been my principle and choice to live my life honestly, and being an educated, decent individual, I could not accept any accusation of being a predator. But my beloved daughter had to try and destroy my reputation, eagerly accusing me as a wrongdoer out of her anger and hatred. This was completely contrary to my principles, for I did not allow her boyfriends to spend the night with her playing sexual games or let her engage in escort service. How could any caring parent allow this, let alone the uninvited and ugliest deed she hoped I would perform? She was my daughter, and I was her father, nothing more. I oppose all those kinds of socially and humanly unacceptable behaviors, but because I was a mere male, allegedly belonging to a wicked world, I had to be the lowest kind of person in the eyes of my beloved wife. And in the case of my wonderful offspring, they could make use of perceived male weaknesses, considering that everybody was the same. Although beyond my complete comprehension, on one side, I heard stories of the ugliest kind, and on the other, there were people who committed suicide because of being wrongfully accused. It seemed that she was endeavoring to achieve what she had planned all along to get rid of me in her empty dreams. None of them, the same as their mother, could understand my nature, nor comprehend what pain they inflicted me with. This time I was going to implement what I had finally decided. I tried to talk to Annette for one last time, but she was exceptionally angry because she did not achieve her prime goal. I remember how she, the vindictive teenager, used to shout at me, "You wouldn't understand me anyway. You are not even my dad." Frankly, I no longer wanted to understand her. Following this incident, I asked her to pack her personal belongings and make her way to her mother's for a while, for it would be healthier for her to get to know her mother a little better. Who knows, maybe her mother could teach her all about life, and perhaps even how to look after herself. That is, if she had time from her witnessing activities. However, I told her that my door would always remain open whenever she decided to come back. Alas, I knew she wanted to leave, probably with her boyfriends. She happily packed what she needed and shouted at me several curly words, You fucking bastard. I will get you for this, and I will get you bashed up. You will see. I knew you were a pufta." Shortly after leaving, she threw stones at the windows and kept shouting on the street, "You fucking bastard. You fucking bastard. Fucking pufta. I knew you were a pufta." When Birgit returned a while later, she was crying bitterly, and seeing me cry, gave me a little hug and said, "Don't worry, Dad. Don't cry." Clearly she had visited her mother discreetly, as she did before coming home. Who knows what the other was going to tell her mother about me, the wicked man, and how she was going to formulate her complaints. Their mother had only been expecting ugliest things from me anyway, since I was not in the truth. A few days later, coming home after a very tiresome day at work, some shopping, and the usual chores, I wondered where Birgit had gone. I prepared the evening meal, turned the television on to hear the latest news around the world, but there was still no sign of her. Then I noticed a piece of torn newspaper, which was left on the coffee table, and curiously picked it up. It was a handwritten note from Birgit. Scrawled in great haste, it said, "Dad, I love you. It is better I stay with Mum, my sister, and my brother. I took my cassette player and my violin also." I felt my world shatter, and was more devastated than ever before. I could not even think anything any more at that moment. The carpet I was standing on was saturated with petrol, and thought that perhaps I had spilt it by accident. I was having a terrible time, and felt it was time to vacate the world. This was just too much to cope with. Feeling rejected, abandoned, and devastatingly sad, I went to Regis, just around the corner, crying. I talked to him, for I knew he had experienced similar conditions when he was divorced from his wife, Marianne, and children, although I did not know the circumstances. He appeared to listen while making very strong espresso coffee, and suggested we should go and have a nice counter-lunch at the Glen Huntly Hotel, with some beer to wash it down. We walked, he needing to stop from time to time, as he was suffering discomfort from angina pectoris and was overweight. He told me his doctor recommended he should walk short distances, and it would do him a world of good. We chatted all about his family circumstances, which led to his divorce, and which had nothing to do with my immediate problems. But nothing could calm me down, although it stopped me from doing the unthinkable. I was glad that we went for that counter-lunch. It was a lifesaver for me, for which I am forever thankful. But again, there was no one who would listen to me, just for once. However, one simple question he asked me sent shivers along my spine. "Have you ever dreamt of making love to another person, but upon waking up discovered you were literally doing it with a cushion?" Was that part of his story which led to his misery? When returning home at a very late hour, the haunting stillness was devastating. I went to my daughter's bedrooms, stood in front of their doors, but I could not open them, as if my hands did not want to turn the knobs. I sighed, and uttered silently the words I used when they went to sleep. "Have a lovely sleep, my sweet, sweet darlings. Tomorrow will be a nice day, and I want you to be happy." When in the lounge, I discovered more of Birgit's handwritten notes, which said, "Dad, you have so many pictures and tapes of us, and I guess you can live with our memories." That was like pouring salt on the wound. I also discovered that some of my textbooks, photographs, sound equipment, and everything dear to me were also saturated with petrol. I knew it had been deliberately done, and thanked them in my unverbalized thoughts for the wonderful memories we shared, and now it was time to start living differently. Then I contemplated that probably none of them was ever going to see me again. Obviously, Magda felt triumphant about Jehovah having brought all her possessions, namely her children, back to her in answer to her prayers. Years later, when Birgit, by a freak coincidence, met me with her friend, when I was enjoying a cup of coffee at the Meyer Store's coffee lounge in the city, she asked me if I remembered her as she approached me from behind. She was grown up and a very pretty young lady. She immediately exclaimed that so many things had happened since she left, all those years ago. Then she promptly told me that her mother had been only telling the truth, and I was not at all a good person. No matter how untrue, she, like her mother, had to be always right in regard to my character being not at all a good person. I was right in thinking when I said children learn what they live, as we discover in Desiderata. During our subsequent meetings, she told me that she now had her own child from a man who was a country singer and Vietnam veteran. Apparently, he was an extremely caring person. According to gossip, her sister was having an affair with him long before, and was probably still in a permanent relationship. He was also supposedly interested in the truth, according to Birgit. But as far as I knew, he was interested in occult, and was close friends with Wendy Clark I had met through my associations with other groups, and, as Wendy told me, poor John's current partner was causing hell for him and wanting to separate, demanding that his house be given to her. When visiting Wendy, I saw photographs of him with my daughter and asked if he was the John I knew as Birgit's current partner. She confirmed it was, and the woman in the photograph was the wretched girl trying to destroy him. What I was to understand of it, I could not even begin to guess. I will be telling you more shortly. During that accidental meeting at Meyer Stores, Birgit told me that although I was disfellowshipped, strongly emphasizing, due to me being really wicked, it was now possible to go and sit with her during the Jehovah's Witness services in their Kingdom Hall, and there was one in St. Kilda. However, she seemed adamant not to listen to anything I tried to tell her. For example, for curiosity I went there after my disfellowshipment, but was treated as if being invisible. Nonetheless, she demanded that we should visit that place during the weekend. She further said that when she had permanently left, she wrote her note to tell me she was going to stay with her mother. She thought of pouring petrol all over my goods, especially my speakers, amplifiers, all my books, and burning them. However, every time she wanted to use the matchsticks to test how good things would go up in flames, the matches would not light for some unknown reason, and so she decided not to do it. She was apparently frightened. I asked why she wanted to do something like that, and she answered me saying, "Because, they are cursed, I think, and you do black magic." I had a feeling that she was not by herself when she wanted to do what she did. In fact, I believe either her sister or mother was with her. Later I asked her again if she thought that it would completely destroy me and make me so sad that I would die, and she answered, Mom never tells lies." I did not need to hear anything else. I knew all that time ago that she was no different than her sister or mother, and certainly not any better than those dogmatic and superstitious witnesses she was part of. You can guess how happy I was when all the wasted years of my life and dreamt of family was no more. I was free. Going back to the time of their leaving me and finding Birgit's kind words as they were, I immediately legally applied for a complete dissolution of all relationships with any members of my so-called family, with the option that maybe one day if any of them wanted to come out of the dark and see me, my doors would be open. I hoped that person would be Claude, because Magda was using every excuse to keep him away from me, as if I was not his father. In fact, for a while I felt I was not my children's father at all, and was living with a fantasy of reality, and she was keeping a secret I was not meant to discover. I was later informed the woman I once loved had been so vindictive under the manipulative advice given by the witnesses that she had taken the children after changing her identity and family name to Johnson and moved to Perth, where she thought she could raise the children as proper witnesses while teaching them to hate the evil in the world, where I apparently belonged, for my religion was electronics, and I seemingly worshipped Satan, which I was not fully cognizant of until Birgit told me. As previously mentioned, Magda was obviously married to Jehovah's Witnesses, who were very capable of doing all kinds of nasties without their adherents being aware, convincing their members to believe they could only tell the truth. It is a religious fanaticism wherein utmost devotion is demanded of their followers, as if they are dedicated to the Creator God. However, unawares, they are in reality obeying rules and regulations conveniently invented by a group of control freaks. Incredibly naive and weak characters like my ex-wife are easily controlled, and with their completely dulled, hypnotically conditioned minds, will do everything as commanded without thinking. I sometimes think that the whole experience I had could only be orchestrated by an evil source in the disguise of seemingly righteous preachers. All those legal expenses were costly, money wasted, and property or investments needed to be disposed of. I could no longer concentrate on anything, not even my work. I needed to take a break and hopefully refresh my mind before any further developments in a positive direction. I believed I could make life work for me and fulfill my dreams. I stayed with Andrea for a little while, but did not want to make her part of my misery, and therefore made the hardest of all decisions. I was going to part for a while, for I had to deal with some of my personal tragedies, with an option that we could get together again, if life did not take a different turn for both of us. Andrea asked me if I missed my family, and I said that there were a few unresolved issues I needed to concentrate on. In fact, with a mind deeply troubled by my own misfortune, I needed some time for myself, although she was more than willing to listen to me. I loved loving her, and not because of her physical charm alone, but for her spirituality and genuine personality. Because of this, I could not allow her to partake in my sufferings. She certainly deserved happiness and not any kind of darkness in her life. I spent some time in spiritual and New Age endeavors, while also spending a lot of time wandering the streets. I felt the need to isolate myself completely from the general public. For a while I lived like a hermit, with a difference. I was amongst crowds of people, but was not part of them. I adopted a policy after being inspired by Pablo Casals, who once exclaimed, "I long for the day when the peoples of the world will sit together, bound by happiness and love of beauty, as in one great concert hall." Now everything was over, Now my daughters had also left me, and I was no longer able to see my beloved son. He had been stolen away from me. In reality, Magda never wanted me to be close to any of my children, believing that I was a bad influence on them for being an unbeliever in their God. With Jehovah's Witnesses dictating every move in Magda's life, the girls were taught to hate the evil, where their father, the devil worshipper, belonged, who they have encouraged to detest. In short, they were forced to hate every move I made. Was I not the soft target they had to direct their absolute hatred at? Many years later, I was to discover that they had built their lives around this belief. When Birgit was a growing-up young lady with her own children, she was still adamantly telling me that I must have been a very violent and rough person, hurting their mother at every opportunity. Their mother was living in a make-believe world, wherefrom she instructed them to believe that she could only tell the truth, for she was a faithful witness. That was a time when the witnesses were, and are still, describing the devil their dear sister had directly experienced by being married to me. When that meeting took place with Birgit after years of separation, she hurt me even further by telling me things from the fullness of her frozen heart, because she did not have any idea about the real truth behind the stories she was force-fed. Alas, she was unwilling to know the reality of things. They were all adamant, telling fictitious stories about me, many of which, according to her friends, were Birgit's own creation. Obviously, none of my supposed children knew me, and had forgotten everything about me. Everything they needed to know about their father had been denied, and Jehovah's Witnesses had become their real parents, with a mother bent to their cultist dictums, which they considered as Christian principles and completely righteous. One tends to ask how such twisted-minded individuals, claiming someone like me as evil, could live with what they accused everybody else of in their assumptions. In reality, who was unjust and evil? I had sacrificed so many things to see my children happy, yet I have been accused of being evil for not believing in man-made myths as true, and not wanting to live in pretend happiness and so-called truth. When the girls left me the way they did, I made my final decision. I was going to disappear after the legal considerations, and was going to give up everything that was, and go somewhere far away. As far as they were concerned, I would disappear altogether, and yet thinking that perhaps one day, if they had any feelings left in them, they could search for me. By this, I was going to give Magda, their righteous mother and faithful sister of Jehovah's Witnesses, a chance to feel proud of her great achievements in destroying my dreams and life. Ultimately, I learned that their love was hatred. Therefore, I still ask Magda, who exists only under the directive of the witnesses, how she could destroy the lives of her own children as well. I will say she preferred to sacrifice them for a cultist organization, which was painted as being Christian and righteous. One day, what is within the heart will come to light. All happy thoughts and ill will be reflected in the face of the beholder. Wait and see. Did I need to regret everything I was or have done? You may be familiar with Catherine Mansfield's words. Regret is an appalling waste of energy. You can't build on it. It's only good for wallowing in. No matter what they prefer to claim in regard to their belief, as if it was the only way to salvation and the only way to please their God. All their activities and the way they conducted their lives were cultist. Any belief system or organization aiming to control the minds of their members and lifestyles is a cult. Some people are blinded with their falsehood, seen as the righteous path, unable to see the light that shineth forth. Maybe they should heed Jesus' advice. When the blind leads the blind, both will fall into the pit. That pit is total ignorance and absolute darkness. Stay within our organization and you will be rewarded. You may need to wait forever for that. It is not much different than advising their adherents to blindfold themselves so that they cannot see anything in the world. Extend your hands, and we will hold them for you, leading you into the truth, which in reality does not exist. The truth will set you free. This is a nice thought, but it may be true only for those who have the courage to look at both sides of the coin and be able to go outside to see the actual reality which surrounds them. Maybe then they can breathe the fresh air and be vitalized. They may even proclaim there is life after all. Whenever they advise their followers to stay within their circles, promising that they will be looked after, they should first go outside that circle to see what world exists out there without judgment. They may discover a world of people, mountains, brick-and-mortar cities, crime, wars, and jealousies. It is also a world of freedom and unconditional love. People almost always find what they are looking for, and according to the fullness of their hearts, they are rewarded. On the other hand, love has to be a freedom song and cannot be limited. Life can never function in a world of restrictions. What I am about to say is by no means biased, and it is this. Many man-made belief systems, particularly cultist movements, only keep people in bondage. And any kind of bondage cannot be equated with freedom. Life needs to be free because the entire humanity remains a free agent. There can be no evolvement and no progression in bondage. Therefore, much of life's experiences must never be nullified. Love, the freedom song, must be sung by all, for bondage of any kind in dogmatic organization is darkness. That is the real evil, not the people freed from those ignorant ways of dogma. I realized that with my final decision I could lose everything, but at least I would be able to keep my sanity. I could comfortably live with my fantasized dreams, just like Birgit had suggested when she jotted down her words. Dad, you have many of our pictures and recordings. You can live with our memories. I cannot and will never forget those words. The only remaining thought for me was this. Thank you, my little love. It really is you, as expected, and every one of you has been just the same. With your very young minds, you can only think this much, but perhaps one day you will understand things better when and if you mature. They could not hear me, and I fantasized that perhaps I could send it out into the fabric of the cosmos in thought, and who knows, maybe one day in their future it could be transmitted back at them. But it could be too late, because human life can be interrupted at any time, for there is no certainty on how long we will be able to remain in this physical dimension. I applied for the very last legal action through the family court system, and preferred to represent myself during the final hearing. Magda had employed a solicitor, and almost the entire congregation of the local Jehovah's Witnesses were also present to provide the necessary support for her. They all probably thought that it was going to be a hard battle, for I could sense how they were uttering their silent prayers. They did not realize that being a peace-loving individual, not desiring to separate the family, and knowing that my beloved children were happier without me, I made sure that the hearing was not going to be prolonged or adjourned. Without even giving a chance to be cross-examined by the court, I explained clearly what I had decided, telling them in a few short words that from then onwards I had nothing more to do with my family, who were owned by the Jehovah's Witnesses, although my doors would remain open to them if they wanted to see me sometime in the future. I was no longer going to provide for them, and particularly the witnesses, by that bitter experience of my children spending quality time with me, for they all considered me as an evildoer for being disfellowshipped and an atheist. Whenever my children spent time with me, it had been seen as a bitter experience for the entire congregation and their servant Magda. I decided to divorce my entire family for their happiness and possible everlasting life after Armageddon, the end of the world, as Jehovah's Witnesses were preaching for many decades. Like their forever-changing policies and predictions, 1975 came and went, and none of their following prophecies came true. On the other hand, I was no longer prepared to be accused of wrongs as a non-Jehovah's Witness. There was mention of my wealth to be divided, on 90% to my former family and 10% to me. That did not sound right, as I thought such divisions were usually on a 50-50 basis. There seems to be some injustice against men when they divorce. In my case, they could have it all, 100%, and then I would be free from the psychological warfare which the witnesses conducted against me. It was a very hard and sad decision, but I had to do it, as I could not see any light at the end of the tunnel, because that tunnel was in complete darkness, created by a very destructive Christian cult. The maintenance of the children was briefly considered, and remained dangling in the air. But by also letting them have my 10%, it was covered. Think of it as being an impossible dream. In my heart, I knew I could make my life work again, without interfering nightmare of Jehovah's Witnesses. Under their strict control of Magda for years, they have been trying everything to undermine my intelligence, downgrade my individuality, and belittle me in all aspects of my life, and then kick me out. I simply removed myself, sincerely hoping that it pleased Magda and my beloved children, and hopefully it has helped them. I knew that what I decided to do made her controllers feel triumphant beyond words. I was free at last, and waking up from a dreadful nightmare. It felt like being reborn, and soon I was to coordinate my life once more. I was beginning to paint over the canvas previously painted, although I could discard it and start a brand new project using a fresh one. Firstly, I needed to move out from where I had been trying to paint something beautiful on the canvas of life, applying various methods to make it work. However, Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to put their graffiti upon my tableau. As they say, too many cooks spoil the broth. Likewise, too many artists with different outlooks could never achieve beauty and meaning in any painting unless they are well coordinated. Therefore, a brand new canvas needed to be used, along with a new set of paints and brushes. In reality, nobody should attempt to paint someone else's artwork, for it can only be done by the individual artist themselves. For a while I spent time meeting with friends for a friendly chat. I met up with Reg more often, went shopping, listened to his stories, and enjoyed some counter-lunches. I even took a part-time cashier's job with him at a video games venue. The idea behind this exercise was primarily to assist him find some value in living, while also occupying me with something completely different. While spending time at the Theosophical Society, I met new friends, some of whom were real eccentrics. I met a few television newsreaders and made friends. Andreas Gaborfi was certainly very special, for he was maintained that he was from the Central Sun government. He used to take his own images on Super 8mm films, wearing glass lampshades, and claiming he had encountered space people from a variety of other planets. He had the tendency to stop in the middle of the city streets just to ask police officers about what planet they came from. We all had some idea about his state of mind, but out of respect, we appeared to be very serious about his personal traits. He was an artist, spending days to create mandalas and usually giving them away to people, but he may have been selling some of them. According to his own stories, he was once employed in one of the hospitals as an orderly, but after his alleged discovery of an unusual food being served in the hospital, he was dismissed. He told us that he had studied medicine. Andreas spoke perfect Hungarian, and his English was pleasantly accented. However, he adamantly claimed he was Belgian, but he did not speak that language or any French, and when someone made a comment about him being Hungarian, as mentioned earlier, he displayed a great degree of anger, insisting he was from Belgium. When living in Caulfield, in a small bungalow behind a set of flats, which he divided into several compartments using tent canvas, and loved showing some of his specially chosen friends what he had: a collection of doctor's outfits in white, special crystals and photographs of UFOs, newspaper cuttings, and his unique console on a small table with a number of colored stones, crystals, and medium to large-sized old radio tubes with a plastic dome on top, obtained from one of the shops. He believed it was his control mechanism when he communicated with other planets and UFOs. He introduced me to an OAHSPA Bible, telling me that his neighbor had read it and suffered with his intelligence afterwards, as he was apparently not ready for it or wanted to use it for not so good reasons, losing his marbles due to being possessed. This Bible was apparently talking about the making of the universe, and contained great wisdom for humanity. When I read it, however, I could not find anything which would contribute to a person's mental breakdown. As mentioned, Jumei was a very generous and genuine friend I met for the first time at the Theosophical Society, and she was in love with Andreas. She was also an eccentric about life and believed that Earth was, like a womb, generating life streams from within. When Natura Health Foods, managed by Mr. John Veldhoven, needed some people to take care of a few important maintenance issues, I volunteered. My 8-year-old daughter Annette was with me during her school holidays, and this is also the time when I was kicked out by Magda and her cohorts. Annette and I became family friends with the Veldhovens. They invited us to stay with them at their home in Boy-Morris for a while. Alas, it was at this time Annette was abducted. My friend's older son suffered from Down syndrome. Out of curiosity, I attended some of their gatherings in a hired room in front of the Theosophical Society building. They belonged to a group they called Abdrushin, following a Swiss-based German-speaking master and philosopher's teachings, wherein reincarnation was accepted as the truth. For a little while, and for friendship, I researched into their belief and was fascinated with their acceptance of reality, which contained elements of Buddhism and Hinduism. It was a study and research on my part, for philosophy has always interested me. This was also a time when a number of eccentrics were interested in getting to know me better. A young man seeking gurus to follow came to my place to be part of my team in his wonderfully dreaming mind. One evening we were still talking about spiritual issues with him, and after Annette went to sleep, I was surprised by his wanting to sleep naked in my bed, just to be blessed by a guru, which was apparently me. However, I let him sleep alone, while I kept awake sitting elsewhere, silently reading my books. In the morning, he was happy having slept in my bed and believed he was now blessed. We certainly meet some very unusual people throughout our lives. At least Annette did not see that young man staying with us that night, as she was sound asleep. I also remember in that room there was an antique cabinet which needed to be restored to its original state, and I had the pleasure of working on it. When my daughter was found, I decided to move on and lost all contact with those gentle friends. When I lived at a Brighton Road address in Elwood for a very short period of time, the noise from the road was unbearable, and so inevitably I had to move out from there. Annette had gone back to her mother's. Devastated and miserable, I moved to Turak and daily frequented the village coffee shops just to rediscover my place in the world. My music system sounded really fantastic there. Thus my listening to music at home was an unforgettable experience. The sound streaming from just 2 channels stereo was magically much better and had the same characteristics of surround sound systems, for the acoustics in the lounge were perfect. At this time, I invested in the very first handcrafted CD audio player by Sony. As you can guess, none of my children were with me during that period of time. They were pickled by their loving and completely righteous mother, who apparently never told lies. It felt like a well-deserved holiday. During my employment as the Health and Welfare Liaison Officer with the state government, I met many interesting people. One such person was a former police officer from Turkey and wanted to settle in Australia, needing my help to make it a reality. His application was accepted, and he rented a housing commission flat in Flemington. He used to visit me even long after my employment suddenly came to an end due to the changed political atmosphere. When I started in my position, John Kerner was Victorian Premier. One day this Turkish police officer came to my address in Elwood when we were celebrating Birgit's birthday. As can be seen, a long time had passed from the initial separation from my ex-wife, when I was granted custody of my daughters. I remember one time when we walked to St. Kilda and Luna Park with him, he discovered dry human blood on the ground by one of the bus stops, upon which he debated issues concerning criminology. He spoke about his interest in joining the Australian police force. Shortly after, I helped him apply to the Victorian Police, and it was suggested that he first learn English and attend the academy. In this way, he could be recruited, but he expected miracles forthwith. He wanted to start working as a police officer immediately, and exclaimed that he could not wait until he could beat the crap out of people. At first, one took it as a joke, but later understood it to be a policeman's dream in Turkey. While living in Turak, I met him in the city, and when visiting shops I discovered an Italian girl. I became friends with her, and she often visited me in Turak village. And we took lots of pictures of the streets, people, and old chapels. I gave her the gift of a necklace with small diamonds, which I originally bought for one of my daughters as a token of appreciation. But the one who got my gift did not appreciate it, and threw it from the balcony into the backyard. Later I found this rather expensive jewelry and kept it hidden. I was very happy to give it to someone who cared for me, even if this friendship was to last only for a short while. This girl lived in Brunswick with her family and happy to spend some time with me. Previously, I had met some Turkish families and was able to find housing and assist them with their compensation cases. Much later I was told by them that the young Turkish police officer was so angry with me for whatever reason I had no idea about, and was planning to kill me. I did not understand why he wanted to do something like that. I could not comprehend what wrong I had done to him. Further research showed that he had discovered I was not a Turkish citizen, but an Armenian dog. Like this story, a number of other Turks I had helped in the past developed similar attitudes towards me because of my background. I was surprised that people had brought their undesirable characteristics and behavior with them when they migrated to Australia. I do not think that the Australian authorities had thoroughly investigated these migrants when they allowed them into the country. One hoped that those attitudes would no longer provide any threats to Australian citizens in the future. However, Jehovah's Witnesses were not any different when discriminating against those who did not follow their footsteps, considering them unworthy to live with the excuse that it was God's will. After what I observed, I toyed with the idea of never associating with certain people anymore. For somebody like me, accepting everybody as they were, it was hard to swallow, because it did not matter for me what nationality, race, or belief system people belonged to. I accepted and loved everyone equally. I always preferred to be kind to everybody and volunteered to assist all wherever and whenever I could. I always wanted to see every human happy and healthy. While completely isolating myself from the wider community, I intermittently kept lecturing on all kinds of subjects from psychology to philosophy. In a short while, I was again involved in a number of club activities: the Astronomical Society, Victorian UFO Research Group, yoga, and meditations to clear my mind from my previous nightmares and to reduce those emotional pains. My then family doctor on Turak Road, Dr. MacDonald, diagnosed my stress-related health concerns and asthma for the first time. He advised that my emotional state would not threaten my health for long as I was in control, but my asthma could be a lifelong issue. The medications he prescribed were excellent, for which I was grateful, and was very saddened upon discovery of his passing due to ill health. I loved living in Turak, although at times the place could be a little noisy with trams, cars, buses, and lorries. When the place I lived in was sold and various architectural changes were planned, I decided to move to a nearby flat on Williams Road. I was ultimately planning to travel to Britain. My intention was to stay in London for as long as I could and perhaps travel back to Australia from time to time to see my select friends. But if things did not eventuate the way I envisaged, I could always come back or live partially in London and also in Melbourne. It was better to tell no one where I was going and when. I felt the need to disappear for a while for peace of mind, and hopefully then I could concentrate on a brand new chapter of my life. Speaking of Melbourne and a few select friends, in reality, most of my story up to this point in time was enacted and written there, and therefore a return to this beautiful city would be logical. Robert Louis Stevenson once declared, "We are all travelers in the wilderness of this world, and the best we can find in our travels is an honest friend." Remember Henry W. Longfellow's words? It takes less time to do a thing right than it does to explain why you did it wrong.